Chapter 9 of Manners from Heaven by Quentin Crisp. Recorded for Deborah. Chapter 9, Time, Space, and Manners. Opening quote from Thomas Carlyle, Sartor Resartus. Good breeding differs, if at all, from high breeding, only as it gracefully remembers the rights of others, rather than insisting on its own rights. In the late spring of 1982, the New York Times published an article by Mr. Ron Alexander called "Once Again, Etiquette is a Popular Topic." As proof of this trend, he enumerated the books that had recently been issued or were soon to be published. Mrs. Vanderbilt's book on social rituals had just been revised by a Miss Baldridge. This lady's name is Letitia. She had to write about etiquette. A Mrs. Mary Susan Miller was working with the granddaughter of Mrs. Post to bring up to date that great lady's work on the same topic. Miss Manners' Guide to Excruciatingly Correct Behavior by Mrs. Judith Martin was published in June 1982 and went on to become one of the biggest bestsellers of the season. Actually, one of the best books on the subject, Class Acts by Canadian writer Eve Drobot, was published by Van Nostrand Reinhold in that midsummer as well. Women write nearly all of the books on this subject. There are two exceptions: the new Office Etiquette by Mr. George Mazet, which concentrates on the new etiquette toward women in business, and Modern Manners by Mr. P.J. O'Rourke, who describes himself as a child of the 60s and who therefore has had to learn about manners as one would a dead language, from archaeologists of more polite periods of human history. Mr. O'Rourke apparently discovered good manners on the road to Damascus and has been preaching the gospel ever since to the heathen readers of Playboy and Rolling Stone. The sudden resurgence of interest and refinement, according to the New York Times article, was said by Mrs. Mary Daly, who organizes adult education classes in Style, Manners, and Grace for the Network for Learning, to have become as widespread as the desire to understand herpes. Her explanation was that Americans were scared by rising unemployment and the economic crunch. They had had a free and easy lifestyle, which didn't really work, and now they were clamoring for security. I doubt this exegesis. The stratum of society which is most interested in etiquette, old or new, is largely unaware that unemployment is increasing, and in any case there is no security in etiquette. Once you know that such a thing exists, you never have another moment's peace. Life becomes as frightening and full of subtle acrimony as a game of bridge, a pastime in which the conventions change hourly for no other reason than to make the unwary players feel uncomfortable. In the same article, Mrs. Luce is quoted as saying that manners incline you to treat people with a certain distance and formality until a friendship is formed. I, conversely, feel that as distance decreases, affection fades. One should never allow one's mind to develop poor posture through the slouch of informality. There is nothing to be gained, but much can be lost by getting to know someone too well. Elsewhere in the article, a Mrs. Art Buchwald declares that the way people look has a lot to do with the way they behave. I'm sure this is true. All actors tell you that they are greatly aided in playing a part by putting on a costume for it. It would be possible to bring formal manners back to the world in an hour if a way could be discovered of gumming long white gloves onto the needle-pitted arms of teenagers. Unfortunately, this theory, though appealing in its sprightliness, would reduce courtesy to a fad. Originally, politeness expressed some genuine awareness of the susceptibilities of others. This second time round, it will be a passing craze and no more. If girls take to wearing ball gowns, it will be at the whim of manufacturers who wish to use up more fabric. If boys start to address their dates as ma'am and tipping their Boy George hats, it will be a joke started by a fashion magazine editor or a film director. An altered state of consciousness, a genuine humility, will not return. Once the arrogant idea that anyone has rights has been implanted in his brain, it would take neurosurgery to remove it. As Mrs. Buchwald points out, when students lock up the dean of their college, they can't be expected to care where the glasses should go on the dinner table. The young always have rebelled, but in earlier and simpler times they did so laughingly. The smile of youth has now turned into a snarl. High spirits have given way to bloody-mindedness. This does not constitute an improvement. Nevertheless, though hardly a day passes without some outrage being perpetrated in public, often in the name of political redress, books on manners continue to be written, and at least once a month, to be borrowed by unknown readers from public libraries many years after their first publication. In England, the eagerness to read these works does not arise from a desire to put anybody at his ease. It is the result of a wish to save face. Sometimes it conceals an even baser motive, a longing to enter a higher society than that occupied by the climber's parents. It is thought by some that carefully mastered etiquette will render it possible to make the transition without a trace of humble origins being visible to new-found friends. In America, the interest in guides to good behavior stems from a more altruistic motive. Hospitality is a rule in America. It is very important to Americans, a part of the way they see themselves as rich and generous uncles. So, when Americans read books about manners, they are by and large trying to improve their hospitality. There is a confusion in both countries about the difference between etiquette and manners, and the two terms are often used interchangeably. But etiquette is concerned with rules. Its true relative is theology, not manners. Books on etiquette require hundreds of pages to list all the do's and don'ts, as interpreted by the author from the Dead Sea Scrolls of earlier tomes and times. Books on etiquette tell you what to wear to funerals and where to seat people at dinner parties. The advice given tends to be gravely conservative. Dinner parties are organized in strict accordance with the Noah's Ark principle. All guests are invited in male and female couples, male and female createth he them, or else paired up by a matchmaking hostess, and seated in an exact arrangement as though sex were going to take place the moment the meal is over. So marked is this principle that, if you follow the instructions, you may be required to invite guests whom you do not like simply because they are the right sex and will add the right touch in these arrangements. Even today, some arbiters of etiquette, such as Letitia Baldridge, in the completely revised and updated edition of Amy Vanderbilt's Everyday Etiquette, state categorically that the proper seating arrangement at a dinner party is as follows, quote, "The male guest of honor sits on the hostess's right, the next most important sits on her left, the female guest of honor sits on the host's right, the second most important on his left, and so on. Husbands and wives should not be seated together." End quote. Mrs. Judith Martin, in Miss Manners' Guide to Excruciatingly Correct Behavior, opts for a much more relaxed approach. Perhaps it is time for the givers of dinner parties to weigh the pleasures of a symmetrical table against the pleasures of being hospitable. Miss Manners, who is by no means immune to the joy of a well-ordered table, nevertheless votes for hospitality. Simply arrange your guests around the table in terms of compatibility rather than sex. This cheerful bit of liberality does not extend to formal occasions, however, where Miss Manners reverts back to being excruciatingly correct. It is not my intention to quarrel with other writers in the field. Indeed, some issues of the Times Literary Supplement or the New York Review of Books have already been so venomous that I have had to make a mad dash to the medicine cabinet for some becoming antidote. I do feel obliged to point out, however, that most books on manners are as basically conservative as papal encyclicals, and make concessions to social change begrudgingly as if there was something wrong with life evolving to any state beyond the Middle Ages. My approach is to employ the guidelines of the past where they are still useful, otherwise I toss them aside. I believe the human mind is better engaged through imagination than obedience. When dealing with the possibility of dinner-table embarrassments, such as those posed by today's odd couples, interracial, intergenerational, or just plain unisexual, who frequently turn out to be perfectly decent folk with a weakness for vice, one of the best ways of diplomatically concealing who is cohabiting with whom is to abandon the sit-down dinner party altogether and serve a buffet dinner party. Then the guests can mingle in an informal way, and your mother-in-law need not know that your son has brought his boyfriend, or your daughter is having an affair with one of her college professors who has just left his wife and 2 children on her behalf. As a general rule, any dinner party where you may sit where you like, you may assume you can sleep with whom you like. There are many young people today who think that it is stuffy and old-fashioned to have any rules of behavior. Part of their attitude seems to be a legacy from the unstructured 60s, when letting it all hang out and doing your own thing became the prevailing precepts of social behavior for the young, with many a messy result. Another part seems to be the legacy of modern psychology from the 1920s and 1930s, when parents were encouraged to be less repressive and more permissive in raising their children. In some families, manners went out of the window and haven't been seen since. A rebellion against too much starch in social behavior is understandable, but a rebellion against being considerate to others is not. Such a policy will surely return to haunt one. For if you are free to be inconsiderate to others, they will certainly feel free to be inconsiderate in return, and the quality of life declines steadily. I encourage people to become conscious of their words and actions as a means of pollution control in social relations. Some people in contemplating my life conclude that I am much too meek and mild to set any sort of example for them. Robust beings that they are, full of caffeine and nervous energy. You've allowed yourself to be walked over. I'm not putting up with that, they will say, or more commonly, not say, but quietly think. They do not grasp that it would have been fatal for me to try to combine flamboyant strangeness with acts of hostility. I survived through politeness. What I accomplished on a small stage using the art of manners, men such as Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi achieved on a much larger scale and stage. It was the genius of Gandhi to combine a philosophy of good manners with a flair for worldwide publicity. He was 1 part otherworldly holy man and 2 parts press agent. His apparent modesty and apparent humility, combined with a shrewd wiliness, enabled him to exploit practically any unpleasant social situation under British rule in India to his advantage. Gandhi was among the first world leaders to realize that many political acts of brutal repression, torture, and murder are tolerated by the general public as long as its members aren't made forcibly aware of them while they are happening. The nightly coverage of the Vietnam War posed a similar obstacle to the United States government. When people were obliged to read newspaper stories or see newsreel coverage depicting a mild-mannered Indian and his followers being badly treated by the British, A climate of world opinion was created that eventually doomed any possibility of the continuation of British rule in India. Manners 1. This same technique worked in my life as well, though unlike Gandhi, I did not plan any of it. When I was beaten up by bullies in the back streets of London, no one cared. People vaguely knew that such things happened, but they were insulated from the details. Many years later, when the television version of The Naked Civil Servant was shown, however, people were moved to contemplate the indignities that I had been subjected to, and why, and by whom, and in the court of public opinion. I was not only vindicated, which was gratifying, but venerated, which was sheer ecstasy. If I were to live my life over, I wouldn't go anywhere without a portable video camera. I do not know why it is so, but there seems to be a great difference between the extent and kinds of cruelty which the public will tolerate. If cruelty is presented abstractly, a verbal report of a massacre that occurred a year ago in a country thousands of miles away, it is tolerable. But if it is presented with concrete immediacy, a film report of people being seized and tortured this very day in any part of the globe, it is not. But I suggest that this difference in tolerance for violence is one that all of us who seek a well-mannered world should exploit. Publicize all villainies. Place all human evil in a limelight so that it can be seen for what it is, and not glorified as something in the national interest. Maybe we should create a new sport called bully ball, in which the world's most aggressive creatures can batter themselves to smithereens and leave the rest of us alone. Mankind is in danger of being exterminated by its weakest link. Macho man, a physically strong, emotionally volatile, and intellectually limited creature who is now obsolete in evolutionary terms, but who is capable of causing the death of all of us through his paranoid plots. He cannot be outgunned, outbombed, outmissiled. He can only be outwitted. The politics of manners go far beyond the realms of behavior mapped by Emily Post or Amy Vanderbilt. There is much more at stake here than whether one should pour tea from left or right to left. Let us consider some of these deeper implications of good manners. All systems of prescriptive behavior, morals, ethics, protocol, manners, may be said to be the imposition of form upon a dynamic reality. For a time it may be centuries long or decades short. A near match may occur between the mental construct of the natural world, and then for a time all is well, or so it seems to those who invented or represent a certain school of human behavior. Inevitably, however, new generations, changed circumstances, and advances in technology alter the human reality which the system of prescriptive behavior seeks to regulate. A gap occurs between the new conditions of life and the picture of how it used to be that is retained in the minds of older people. Or young people rewrite the rules. In either case, as Walter Lippmann pointed out in a famous essay, the world outside and the pictures inside our heads. Quote, "The map does not fit the territory." End quote. A small wonder that people get confused and lost. Some curse the old maps, some curse the new territory. When a system of prescriptive behavior does not change, indeed, in some cases, makes intransigence a virtue, it becomes increasingly anachronistic and even a dangerous nuisance. This process frequently makes the upholders and true believers in an old system, say the British system of etiquette, even more dedicated to maintaining its traditions. The problem with most old systems of behavior is not that they are old, nor even that they resist change, but that their high priests and followers develop a siege mentality and end up being opposed to change, pitting the past against the present in yet another needless struggle. In order to survive, systems of prescriptive behavior must adapt The spirit of a code must always be seen as more important than the letter of its laws. Failure to change, when that is due, only undermines respect for the entire system. If one associates morality with some puritanical person or some zealous organization, which is against practically everything, one is not going to have much use for moral principles. If one associates manners with some sort of dainty matriarchal dictatorship, then one is going to be tempted to ignore the whole business as pre-feminist silliness. In the 1980s, any man who, on principle, escorts a woman down the city streets by walking on the outside, originally conceived as a courtesy to protect milady from the hazards of horse-drawn carriages, now exposes her to the more likely discomfort of being dripped on by air conditioners or shat upon by pigeons. This is only a small example of the calamities that may occur by maintaining an abstract rule that once made sense. Just as there are dead languages and living languages, so too there are dead manners and living manners. While the dead manners of the past may be of interest to archivists and historians, they must never be mistaken for the more sensible designs for living which are closer to the needs of contemporary people. We often hear that there has been a decline in manners, but what does this mean? If we were to cite 100 rules of etiquette that prevailed a century ago and now found that 87 of them are no longer observed, except at weddings and funerals, or perhaps 50% are still in effect, we would not prove that manners have declined, only that certain quaint customs have gone. For manners to truly decline, there must be a measurable diminution in the impulse to be mannerly, or a lack of knowledge of what mannerly behavior consists of now, coupled with a lack of interest in acquiring such knowledge. There is no proof of this. Wherever I have traveled in the United States, I have found an avid interest in the subject. Manners are an art of living, and, like any other art, they undergo changes in appearance, even in substance, and certainly in style, though the impulse which creates them remains constant in every age. Howling about manners declining is rather like calling Picasso a bad artist because he doesn't paint like Rembrandt. As modern people, we have the duty to reappraise everything so that art, science, law, religion, and manners of our century reflect the best of our current knowledge and our most enlightened thinking. Confusion about how to behave in certain situations contributes to gaps. Does a man open every door for a woman, or in these days of claimed equality with the scales having fallen from their eyes, do they take turns? This is a problem fairly easily solved. I would say that whoever is best able to open the door, depending on what kind of door it is, should gracefully contrive to reach it first, and that the sex of this person is immaterial. There are, however, more complex factors in contemporary mass society that appear to predispose people to rudeness, not the least of which is the strain on the psyche and the nervous system of living in noisy, polluted, overcrowded places. In one of the best analyses of our present social condition, Human Scale, by Kirkpatrick Sale, the author contends that, quote, a person surrounded by subways and blaring radios, beset on every side with clamor, confusion, filth, boredom, and hopelessness, might well strike out in rage when provoked. A person surrounded by calm decorousness, purposefulness, and comfort is less likely to. Behavior basically depends on the setting, the time and place and society in which it occurs. Obviously, the desired goal is to find those settings in which the benevolent side of our human nature is encouraged, and the malevolent side dampened. That will not ensure constant and unvarying social harmony, it seems safe to say, but it certainly will go a long way to permitting it and fostering it. End quote. There is a debate among sociologists now about whether it is crowded living conditions, higher densities, sheer numbers, or the amount of interaction that produces the individual and collective pathologies of big cities. Biological studies show almost uniformly that crowding and high densities in animal populations produce such things as hypertension, stress, aggression, violence, exhaustion, sadism, mental disorder, infertility, disease, suicide, and death. For the human animal, rather more adaptable to its surroundings, the evidence is not quite so unequivocal. But since the work of Mr. Greg Simmel at the turn of the century, it has been fairly well recognized that masses of people create masses of social problems. The more people, the more problems. Bad manners may be seen as a distant early warning of more serious social problems in gestation. With more people, there are bound to be more contacts among them on any given day. The New York Regional Plan Association has determined that there are 11,000 people within a 10-minute radius in Nassau County, 20,000 in Newark, New Jersey, and 220,000 in Manhattan. And so, to prevent a psychosocial overload, a city dweller must either have fewer contacts, spend less time on any single contact, or be less intense and involved during any contact. That's what produces the familiar pattern of contemporary big cities. People create fewer contacts by developing ethnic ties and consequent separation from outside groups. They have unlisted telephone numbers, don't make eye contact with people on the street, and ignore lifelong neighbors. They spend less time per contact by cutting out traditional courtesies such as sorry and please, by treating supermarket checkers and short-order waitresses as faceless and historyless, and by refusing to get involved. And they reduce the intensity of each contact by limiting their span of sympathy, in sociological parlance, to the immediate family, by supporting governmental agencies that take over their personal commitments, welfare, for example, and by emphasizing their privacy through personal space cocoons in a lift or cafe, the I'm all right, Jack Walkman crowd. A number of scholarly studies have compared the civilities of people in large cities with those in smaller places, and with rare uniformity they show big city dwellers to be, as the stereotypes would indicate, far more selfish, hostile to strangers, unhelpful and unfriendly. In one study, a group of researchers dialed phone numbers at random in various sized cities, and conducting a plausible story about an emergency, asked the people who answered to look up and call a number for them and leave a vital message. People in the smaller cities were far more responsive. In another study, stamped envelopes were casually left around at restaurants, and the like in different sized cities. The ones from the smaller places were mailed back much more often. Students at the City University of New York compared the responses of people in Manhattan with those in small cities in upstate Rockland County, when asked by strangers if they could come in and use the phone. An average of 27% of the New Yorkers allowed people in, compared to 72% of the others. And one researcher placed abandoned cars in middle-class neighborhoods, first near New York University in a city of 7 million, and then near Stanford University in a city of nearly 10,000, and discovered that the car in New York was rapidly stripped and gutted, while the one in Stanford was actually guarded by passers-by against attempts to damage it. What is interesting about all of these examples is that the very qualities of civility that the urban setting has traditionally been supposed to foster, the word civility, after all, comes from the Latin for city, are least in evidence there. That doesn't mean that anyone interested in a mannerly life should abandon London for Leeds or New York for Eugene, Oregon. It is certainly possible, as Jane Jacobs has documented in her classic book, The Life and Death of American Cities, to preserve an active sense of community within a district of a large city that is not based on xenophobia, establishing a ghetto for people of only one kind, through the formation of block associations and other conscious and deliberate efforts of good neighborliness. By understanding how a particular environment has a destructive effect upon social relations, one can devise strategies to mitigate the damage, and even in some cases prevent it from occurring. Crisp's last law. Reading books on manners and appreciating what good behavior is in all aspects of one's personal and social life is not enough. If one is constantly frustrated and defeated by the environment in which one lives, good manners will remain an elusive, abstract goal rather than an embodied idea. We must at all times seek out those people and situations most conducive to bringing out the best in us, and keep to a minimum our contacts with people who merely drain our energy. It is my view that the British system of etiquette, which is a class system based on snobbery and exclusion, is in its last gasp stage, and that the American Revolution in manners, creating a humanistic base for hospitality based on a principle of kindness and inclusion, will prevail in the future. I believe that we have to recognize that modern societies are changing quickly, and that no inflexible and hidebound system of behavior is capable of providing people with useful maps to the social landscape that are evolving all around us. The British system, which aspires to find a place for everything and keep everything in its place, will not serve as a guide to the future. In America, practically everyone regards himself as middle class and is proud of it, whereas in England to call something middle class is to condemn it. Having pottery ducks on your walls would stamp you as indisputably lower middle class in England, but in America the harshest comment that would be made about having such ducks on your walls is that you must be into 50s kitsch. Things are dated by time here, and to some extent by taste, but never by class. There is a mad desire to be fashionable in America, to change when things change, and always in order to seem young. There is much less desire to seem young in England, but in America, youth is not merely a phase through which one passes, but a lifelong value. That matters, perpetual adolescence. On the other hand, Americans, unlike the English, show little interest in seeming aristocratic or refined, although there are the occasional jokes about people who came over on the Mayflower. Debrett has now produced a book called The Texan Aristocracy, but this is a misnomer because it's really about the rich. And while great wealth may create a glassy shield around certain Americans, it does not bestow any of the attributes of aristocracy. When Americans parade their wealth, they do so chiefly in the form of extreme generosity. When I visited Texas during my lecture tour, I found this to be overwhelming. I was practically handed the keys to the cities of Austin and Houston, but not having been raised with my own Neiman Marcus charge account, I had no idea what to do with such extravagant gifts. The American habit of generosity includes the desire to make others feel at home and to make everyone feel that they are your equal, though not perhaps in wealth. Some years ago in Los Angeles, I attended an awards ceremony, the star of which was Miss Julie Harris. There was a moment when I asked my companions if Miss Harris had arrived. He stood up and looked about, and then, seeing her on the far side of the room, walked over to where she was, evidently to ask her if there was a moment when I might be presented to her. She immediately got up from her table, left everything, and crossed the room in order to present herself to me. This is an instance of the way that the American idea of generosity, hospitality, and good manners work. They endeavor to always make the first move, and they are concerned about creating the impression that it is an honor for them to meet you. When people say that Americans are rude, they usually mean that they are nosy. And they are. They long to know everything about you, and they quite unabashedly ask everything about you, in the middle of the street, even in the dead of winter, But this is because they feel they are your friends, so they don't see their curiosity about you as an invasion of privacy. The English believe people wish to preserve their privacy, and that this should not be invaded by total strangers, particularly not at awkward times. The basic distinction between the two attitudes is whether you treasure more the whole world or your own privacy. I myself do not want any privacy, and am pleased to talk to anybody, including total strangers, about any aspect of my life. All that I ask is that I be left completely alone for 1 or 2 days of the week to recover from the ravages of my sociability. Although there is a reverence for the young in America, there is no blame laid upon people simply because they are old, an attitude which exists in England, where anyone who is having a jolly life at the age of 60 is treated with derision. People keep telling you how ancient you are, and they are almost asking, why don't you just lie down and die? In America, people like Katharine Hepburn, Helen Hayes, Ruth Gordon, to name a few of the actresses who keep on working come hell or arthritis, are regarded practically as heroic figures. In England, the old tend to be pushed aside as dotty relics. But in America, if you can run around Central Park at the age of 86, someone is bound to put you on television, on a cable TV show at least, for the deregulated airwaves are an arid waste in constant need of irrigation. Contra Mr. Orwell, in America people are grateful that they are worth watching. In sum, if manners present a particular difficulty to England, it is how to leave people their privacy without seeming to shun them. And in America, the difficulty is how to offer people your friendship without seeming to intrude. The American way of manners appeals to me, suits me. I am free to go about in an open society. In New York, where everyone who is not hitting you over the head is your lifelong friend, I have grown accustomed to the paradoxical pleasures of American life. Here in the land of 50 million handguns, there is greater interest in and greater potential for creating a civilized, humanistic society, open to all and barring none, than anywhere else on earth. In Russia or Cuba, the likes of me would long ago have been liquidated. In Chile, I would disappear. In Israel, I would be ostracized. In Iran, I would be shot. In England, I would have as I did have, a punishing work record and a meager pension. Only in America am I encouraged to enjoy every aspect of a personal renaissance, instead of accepting an enforced senescence upon reaching my golden age. Once, when my mother was telling me about her school days, she said, "I never liked mathematics. There was only one right answer." So I think she would have liked the American way of manners, for there are many answers to all societal problems, and the only thing that matters is that one's behavior is motivated by a consideration for others. It is enough to be approximately correct in one's social behavior. America alone, among the countries I am familiar with, has the flexibility to change, to incorporate change, and to keep addressing the future on terms that are relevant and self-correcting. Even Americans, of course, are sometimes caught napping, as we have seen in recent years in the automotive and computer industries, where Japan leapt to the lead. But unlike England, there is nothing inherently resistant to change in the social infrastructure. On the everyday level, this means that Americans are more capable than the English of creating a truly hospitable society in which everyone is treated as an equal, without having to overcome the deeply rooted prejudices of a class system, in addition to having to overcome prejudices concerning race, religion, sex, and nationality. In short, Americans have one less handicap to overcome than the English in creating a future society in which a majority of its citizens feel that they are accepted and welcomed. The difference may seem minor and inconclusive, But when one is living through an epidemic of rudeness, one has to call upon whatever medical supplies are available. In that sense, I hail America as the country best able to create a healthy climate for modern manners and to replace outmoded forms of etiquette, which only hurt or hinder people in being misapplied past their expiry date. And that was Chapter 9 of Manners from Heaven by Quentin Crisp. Thank you for listening.